Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you virtually this morning. Thanks for joining us. This is a chance to think a little bit about the politics of interdisciplinary research focused in particular on robotics. And it comes at the end of a series of workshops that Brigstow has been organising with the Bristol Robotics Lab. So just over the last few weeks, working with the team at the Bristol Robotics Lab, we've been organising a series of workshops which have been bringing together roboticists and academics from a whole range of disciplines and creative technologists and artists and makers to think a bit about interdisciplinary research within the space of robotics. And that's with a view to then using some EPSRC impact accelerator account funding to be able to explore some of those ideas through some projects that are going to run from the late summer on through to the spring of next year. So we'll be sure to invite everyone back for the showcase of that work. So in a sense, it'll be a chance for people to explore some of these interdisciplinary ways of working in practice. But Ola has been part of those workshops, and she alerted us to an article that she and a couple of colleagues, Cian and Mehdi, wrote recently, which we thought would be fantastic to have a little bit of a focus on, because it's an article which explores the interdisciplinary politics of robotics research through looking at the robotics lab. And so what we're going to do is invite Ola, Cian and Mehdi to introduce the article, the paper. So we've pre-circulated it, but it'd be great if you could just talk us through it a little bit, some of the kind of underpinnings of that and the findings. And then what we're going to do is have brief responses from a couple of colleagues in Bristol. So Susan Halford is a professor of sociology at the university, and Susan is also co-director of the BDFI, Bristol Digital Futures Institute, which is one of the research institutes in the university like Brigstow, which is focused in particular on socio-technological development. And Susan will say a bit more about that. So Susan's interests really lie at the heart of questions of interdisciplinary research, in particular within the space of technologies. And also joining us is Arthur Richards. Arthur's a professor of robotics and control, and Arthur's also, I think, deputy director of Bristol Robotics Lab, and is someone who's really well placed as well to respond to the paper, because interdisciplinary research within robotics is very much at the core of his interests and concerns. And so what we're going to do is invite the two of them to respond, and then we'll open up for Q&A. What would be lovely is Ola and Cian and Mehdi, for you to introduce us to the main ideas within the paper. And then what we'll do after that is have Susan and Arthur offer a brief response to that. So over to you, Ola and Cian and Mehdi.
Thank you very much. That was a lovely introduction. No pressure now. Okay, so I'm Ola, and together with Cian and Mehdi, we wrote a paper entitled "What is Robotics Made of? The Interdisciplinary Politics of Robotics Research." So thank you very much to Brigstow Institute for having us today and letting us tell you about the paper. And actually the idea comes back to a few years back when I was a PhD student at UWE Bristol, which is just a few blocks away from the lab. And I always was quite fascinating and slightly intimidated by what's happening inside the building. So I just wanted to find an excuse to go inside and do some research on the lab. So, fast forwards, couple of workshops, conversations, and lots of data analysis later, we're here and hopefully having learned something interesting about how robotics research is funded, conceptualized, and then conducted on a day-to-day basis. So you might be asking, why should we care about how robotics research is conceptualized? It's clearly the mission statement. It looks lovely. It cares about science, cares about engineering and society. And our motivation in this paper stems from realizing that Bristol Robotics Lab is a public research facility. It's funded mostly by the public money and is there to tackle societal problems. So indeed, in the UK research landscape, framing like grand challenges or wicked problems tend to dominate the landscape, and robotics researchers often have to promise on the funding bids that their innovations will tackle major issues like climate change, aging population, or road safety. So here we want to encourage a reflection. So are we promising to solve the right challenges? Can we solve these challenges with robotics? And who has the power to ask the right research questions? Oh no. Oh, there we go. So, for example, one well-known area for robotics research is autonomous vehicles. And research papers, they often framed as a matter of improving road safety. However, if we frame this research challenge this way, are we missing on any other aspects of autonomous vehicles? Are we creating any new challenges as a kind of side effect? And perhaps there are lots of other questions we could be asking. So that's the whole idea behind the politics of interdisciplinary research. Like, who has the power to ask the right research questions and get these research questions funded? So throughout the paper, we argue that in order to steer the development of robotics for the societal benefit, we need to look inside research laboratories and investigate day-to-day research practices. So in other words, how high-level mission statements, AI ethics strategies, or responsible innovation framework, how they then translate to researchers' activities. So we took interdisciplinarity as a unit of analysis, let's say, because we thought it could adequately capture the ways people collaborate. Plus, we could look at interdisciplinarity in both qualitative and quantitative ways. Okay, so let me bring a little bit of theory. So in the paper, we cover way more typologies and interdisciplinarity research, but let me bring two key papers here. So first of all, Hutoniemi's review of 20 typologies of interdisciplinarity, look at how we can kind of categorize it, typologize it, and so on. But it's the gist of the message that it boils down to encouraging to ask three main questions. So which disciplines are integrated? Is it sociology and computer science? Is it psychology and design, or something else? And then how is it done in practice? Is it done in papers? Is it done at bidding? Is it done by transferring some theoretical concepts from one place to another? And then why does interdisciplinarity take place? And then adding to that, we also took interest in Kelly's typology of narrow and wide interdisciplinarity. And this encourages us to look at the epistemological traditions behind disciplines and appreciating that it might be a little bit more challenging in practice to integrate disciplines which are positivist and interpretivist in their origin, even if, obviously now it's perhaps slightly more complicated. So, maybe to quantitative disciplines like physics and biology would have more common language than integrating, say, biology and human geography. I'm just giving an example here. Okay, and in addition, we use the concepts of logics and capabilities in the analysis. I think Cian will tell you a little bit more about it, but just to quickly define them here. So we previously did research on capabilities to perform collaborative research. And by capabilities, we mean effectively enablers, what enables you to do good collaborative research. They could be your personal skills, it could be your education, could be your networks, could be, whether your institution allows you to have, exciting seed corn funding, for example. And why is it important? We argue that we need to look at capabilities rather than just outputs. So interdisciplinarity is usually evaluated by the journal publications, by impact factors, but actually we encourage that we should see whether interdisciplinary research creates new capabilities. And then Andrew Barry, a professor of human geography and STS, he brings attention to the guiding logics of interdisciplinarity. So why are we doing this research? And he argues that there are three main reasons. So that's accountability, so making new technologies more socially accountable and kind of more acceptable, let's say. Two, innovation, so actually inspiring development of new technologies, and third, reframing technological objects, so we see them as both material and social. Okay, so in terms of our empirics, we used mixed methods for the study. So we combined qualitative and quantitative perspectives, and we do so to get a rich picture of research at BRL. And just to say, none of these methods are perfect. They all have their flaws. They all have slightly different timescales of unit of analysis. But our idea is not to get a definitive one-word answer to what is robotics made of. It's rather to just create this rich picture, different ways of knowing interdisciplinarity. So we scraped data from 1,644 publications on Scopus and 485 on Web of Science. And bear in mind, they all peer-reviewed publications by BRL staff. And then we categorize them using Carley's et al. 2017 paper, looking at most prominent keywords and also disciplines represented in the papers. And then we complemented this with a document analysis of 63 recent projects, looking at who collaborates with whom and how the project goals were framed. And finally, we did a qualitative field work with interviews, observations, and workshops with BRL staff. Okay, so this is our kind of first results slide, let's say. A bibliometric image, one could say it's a disciplinary map of BRL. And size here denotes, size of the bubbles denotes how frequent these disciplines have been present in publications, and the proximity it's about how often these fields cite each other in general in the general Web of Science corpus. So if we take publications as a key metric, 10 most represented disciplines would be robotics, computer science, automation control systems, biomedical engineering, instrumentation, material science, multidisciplinary sciences, applied physics, optics, pharmacology. I cannot say it in one breath. So in contrast, I can also bring your attention to the red cluster, which is, has smaller dots, let's say, and these are all kind of social and psychological research, and in papers they're less represented. But the reason for that might be that we're only talking here about papers co-written by BRL staff. So they might be the case that there's some written output from BRL projects written by staff elsewhere, so not BRL staff. And if that's the case, I think that tells you a little bit about how interdisciplinary is research when it comes to their research outputs. Okay, so the next bibliometrics map, it's about major keywords, again in peer-reviewed papers. So here, for example, I can bring your attention to the blue cluster, the word human, which is featuring quite prominently. And then I encourage you to ask, who is this human at BRL? And only judging from connotations with other keywords like experiment design, control study, or female, we could argue here that humans at BRL are subjects of experiments. They're not exactly participants in political debates. And then I can also bring your attention to other clusters. So the yellow one, electroactive polymer actuator, is basically a sciencey word for a robotic muscle, which is one prominent area of research at BRL. And then the green one, microbial fuel cell, is a technology used to develop urine power toilets, an innovation that BRL is known internationally. So next, we've got a summary of disciplines representing 63 recent projects. So again, there's quite a large variety, quite a lot of different disciplines represented. Certain fields are here more than others, which is, not surprising. Computer science, different types of engineering are quite heavily represented. And then there is also quite visible presence of psychology and design. And then we looked at how these projects describe their goals. So a majority, 39 out of 63, would say that they respond to societal challenges, and then a third would want to respond to industry needs. Sometimes they would respond to both. And about half of the projects, so 32, involved non-academic collaborators or other universities. And then non-academic collaborators would usually be from the engineering industry, legal practice, insurance, farming, health, but not really from arts or community background. And then we looked at how diverse our disciplines brought together. So we came up with kind of extension of Kelly's typologies, let's say. So narrow interdisciplinarity would encompass subdisciplines of engineering and computer science. Medium interdisciplinarity, we coined this term to look at combination of robotics, CS, engineering, and life sciences and psychology. So it's like still predominantly positivist disciplines. And then wide would involve arts, humanities, and social sciences, the more interpretivist ones. So that's it from my part of the presentations. I can now pass to Cian.
Okay, so Ola, thanks. That's super. And I guess that's in some ways what Ola's just shown us is really a top-down view, maybe of some of the kind of capabilities for doing interdisciplinary research, some of the academic outputs, some of the relationships, some of those lines between the nodes, which represent research groups, research clusters. And I think already we've seen a huge diversity of different types of knowledge circulating around BRL and coming out of it. I guess what I want to do is is really situate this research and come at it from the other side, come at it really from a grounded perspective. And one of the things we did in the papers is we investigated 3 different research situations. So and try to understand what is it that makes a difference in these situations. What is the social, the material, the technical, the kind of epistemological even knowledge and things that make a difference to different to interdisciplinary research in different situations. So I'm going to take us through a case and draw some observations then. And so one way we thought about politics of robotics is to ask what choices are being made as robots are being woven into everyday life, right? What's at stake? For whom are these stakes important? What are the imaginations or logics, as Ola has described them, that guide this work? And what are the capabilities that are required to sustain these choices, right? To actually do robotics, to be a roboticist. Apologies about the siren. So I guess I want to do a case study of the assistive. I want to talk about the assistive living robotics team and a project they did at BRL. And I guess the way I look at it is the assistive living robotics team, the folks who are doing that have built research capabilities in the area of independent living. Interdisciplinary robotics technologies are used in support of maintaining an independent and healthy home life for folks in the real world. And so that's technologies like lifting and picking, automation technologies, voice, alerts, monitoring systems. And I guess the idea is that ALR technologies help in real world situations, they help avert the early move into institutionalized care, right? They enhance individual end user resident well-being. So there's clear societal benefits there for who. Well, we could ask that maybe another time, but I think the societal impact, the potential for impact, the impact already is pretty clear. So in this case, I used this map right here to find my way around the campus and across the road to Stoke Gifford, which is the other side of one of the roundabouts there up by the university campus. It wasn't a sunny day like that. That's from Google Maps. It was a pretty miserable day. But I've been directed by some of the folks in BRL to kind of go and have a look at a 2-year pre-COVID knowledge transfer partnership. This is 2018, I think, in the Stoke Gifford Retirement Village, with some folks from from Extracare Charitable Trust. It was an Innovate UK funded project in the order of £100,000 or so. So huge by standards, but certainly sizable enough to fund a researcher and various different activities for a couple of years. So according to Innovate UK, the goal was to develop a company-wide working expertise of smart living technologies such as intelligent sensing, socially assisted robotics, via research in a living lab. So this really is taking robots and robotics outside the lab into society, which I think was one of the underpinning kind of framings of this whole piece. The Extracare communities, they're interesting because they're designed for people who are no longer able to live entirely independently, but who don't yet require kind of the comprehensive level of support we'd expect, say, in a typical British care home, or what we used to call nursing homes. And so that was an interesting question for us in looking at the politics here, is what happens when we bring robots and robotics outside the lab? So in my visit, I encountered a brand new kind of 200 residency facility across the road. There weren't so many, classically charismatic robots that you may see on a tour of BRL if you're showing visitors around. But there's a lot of monitoring, a lot of beeping from the kitchen, a lot of things in wall sockets. The blinds in the bedroom were automated. But what struck me in this situation was, and I'm going to call him Matt, who was the resident robotics engineer. He seemed to be more important than any of the robots there. His job was to introduce the technologies to a test department, especially kitted out in the facility, but also to introduce residents to the technologies. And I think really his job was to find skills gaps. So this is a very social job he had as a trained roboticist engineer, was to find skills gaps in the users, in the residents, to address them, and to really look for gaps or where these technologies could be inserted. So a hugely explorative type of project and type of job. And one quote I want to read out, he said to me, he said, I think my job's mostly around trying to see where and if robots fit realistically at this point in time. Because a lot of the robots are kind of made for the future, right? But we're here now. We want to see a return from all this technology today. And I guess by we, he meant the Extra Care organization, he meant BRL, and he meant Innovate UK. And the role of Innovate UK here, which really is I think it is as a funding agency is about building markets, building economic capacity within the UK. That's really guided the language, the framing of the problems. There was trials for marketplaces for technologies, that kind of thing. And there was also, what struck me, there was a lot of integration of regular consumer electronics in there, not just the big time robots. There was a lot of Amazon Alexas. Matt was doing some bespoke data platform monitoring work to go with them. But one of the things that struck me was, well, what happens when some of this stuff goes wrong? Who does the maintenance? Who does the repair? Matt said he spent a lot of time setting up, a relatively mundane job of setting up technology, entering passwords for people on some of the consumer side. And some of those, the kind of the power asymmetries between, say, an Amazon help desk and folks on the ground there really did strike me. Okay, so let's draw some kind of observations from this. First, on the capability side, I think there was capabilities there to include end users in knowledge production. Some of the experiments and schemes that Matt was and the PIs were running really involved the end users. There's capabilities to build and maintain infrastructure. So on the picture here, on the top left, you see the personalized assistive living studio within BRL, and some of the technologies, some of the methods to test these technologies were brought over across the road. So those knowledge infrastructures as well as material infrastructures were really important in the capabilities to build and use them, and capabilities to build a diverse network of regional stakeholders. And that was, broadly around the assistive living robotics group. I think some of the partners that they work with in the community, local authorities, local governments around issues like air is quite interesting. The second observation is about infrastructures. And so there's a logic of testing and experimentation here that draws on probably 15, 20 years of living labs being developed around the world in different settings and trying to do innovation, technology development closer to society. So in theory, improving societal accountability and by doing more robust science with people in the real world. I guess the next piece I draw the attention to really is some of the background policies, institutional context, and certainly some of the Innovate UK stuff here was at that time guided by the 2017 industrial strategy, but also a framing of older people as an aging society, and these framings, this kind of institutional background played a kind of a big part in two logics. The logics, if you remember, that Ola was talking about, a logic of innovation. So in other words, innovation is generally seen as a good thing in these kind of documents. Risks and uncertainty of innovation is kind of buried away. And innovation is there to be mobilized in pursuit of kind of these predetermined societal challenges, or at least they're determined not by the people in the care home here, not in Exeter, but in Whitehall, in Westminster. And indeed influenced by the work of BRL in other regards. But there's also a logic of crisis. And remember, this is before COVID, but even so, in this area of robotics, we see really strong framings around aging populations, not enough money in the pot for local authorities to pay for care, so efficiencies are important. Post-Brexit staffing shortages are a big deal and continue to be so. And these are all deeply political ways of seeing the world. They're often contested, but where they're contested is an interesting point. So there's some of the things floating around influencing what capabilities are valued and how interdisciplinary is done here. So just 2 quick slides left. So thinking about the logics, the rationales for interdisciplinary robotics research here in this assistive living robotics example, we see, the innovation, and innovation really, primed as a public good, market creation and Innovate UK's role in that, dealing with crisis, and this notion of doing science, doing technology development closer to the society and hopefully being accountable. But this differs in other parts of the lab, in other parts of that big, those big bibliometrics diagrams that we saw earlier. We see different logics elsewhere, and they're in the paper. Just focusing on the capabilities then, and some observations from that, finally. What's interesting, I think, is that there is diversity here. There's BRL's avoiding kind of a one-size-fits-all approach to publicly funded robotics. There's capabilities for kind of agencies, with the kind of multiple and different professors there. And part of this, if we're going to deal with societal ills, maybe we need to think about how some of these capabilities distribute rather than concentrate the ability to ask research questions, the ability to steer research and focus it on certain issues rather than others. And that makes us think about this notion of accelerating versus steering robotics with interdisciplinary research. So in other words, is it the job of roboticists, is it the job of interdisciplinary research simply to diffuse, to push technologies out into society, or actually should we and how should we be working with different groups to make sure that those technologies match needs and match different societal needs. And one of the things we noted in the paper, I'm not going to talk about it at length here, is just a difference in the ability of researchers to steer under different funding conditions, under different, interests, and the difference between, say, the area of autonomous vehicles we saw, in which there was a strong acceleration drive government given. So last slide. This was an interesting quote from one of the roboticists, and I guess I want to use this just to say, look, how is this focus on capabilities useful? Why maybe is it interesting to take note at the end of this series of workshops that you've been doing? Well, we think there's value here in providing a formative evaluation methodology. In other words, a kind of a way of seeing how robotics is being shaped as you go. And maybe some of the measures in looking at the logics and capabilities, can look at assessment of the impact on individual roboticists, on groups missing from maybe classic evaluation methodologies. And it can help say, okay, how is the material infrastructure impacting here? So that's it. That's all I've got to say. And I guess I'm looking for a response and so on.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks, Ola and Cian, for those really brilliant reflections and introduction to the paper. And it's always lovely to read the paper, but then also to have the authors talk around it, because you get so much more from that kind of contextualizing and introduction to the ideas behind it. Susan, over to you. It'd be great to have responses now, brief responses from Susan and Arthur. So Susan, do you want to offer some reflections?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I'll try and keep it brief. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and particularly a pleasure to have the opportunity to be here with Arthur. And he and I have talked often over the years about some of these issues, so it's really nice to have this opportunity to respond together. Thanks also to Cian and Ola for your paper. I think it's an incredibly carefully written paper, and at the same time manages to be very provocative. And I think that's incredibly important. And I want to say at the outset that it really demonstrates to me your commitment to interdisciplinarity. You know, taking interdisciplinarity itself as the focus of your object of inquiry, if you like, and being critical. Yes, you're being critical, but I think that critique absolutely shines through that you're deeply committed to interdisciplinarity at the same time. So I think it should be essential reading for anyone working across a very broad range of disciplines which you're describing, particularly for those of us who are concerned with instating social analysis into digital innovation, which of course is something that the University of Bristol, which I can't speak for other universities, but the University of Bristol is deeply committed to, and also the Bristol Digital Futures Institute, which Tim mentioned at the beginning, is committed to. And just for those of you in the audience who don't know, it's worth saying that BDFI is jointly led. So I'm a sociologist and I'm one of the leaders of BDFI, and the other leader academic leader comes from engineering, is a network engineer. And our remit is to work across the whole of Bristol University, right from classics and philosophy through to chemistry and quantum physics and everything in between. So I think that's very relevant to some of the issues that you're describing here. And specifically, perhaps in relation to what you said, Cian, BDFI seeks to develop theoretically strong and methodologically robust ways of engaging very concretely with futures and futures in the making. And that's a whole other topic that we could talk about another time. But I think that kind of promissory future-oriented narrative is very, very strong in many of these socio-digital, socio-technical collaborations. And it's something that itself needs to be the object of inquiry, I think, although beyond the scope of any one paper to do all of that. So the overriding message that I take from your paper is that interdisciplinarity doesn't happen just because we express nice abstract commitments to it, critical as those are, those high-level statements of intent, but depends on two key things. And it depends, first of all, on the combination of social and material resources that are assembled in order to do interdisciplinarity. And that is, you know, in typical STS fashion, that is quite a heterogeneous list of resources, whether it's social scientists or lab managers or funding streams or theories or pieces of robotics as actual physical equipment. But critically, it's understanding that combination of resources and the relationships between them, which are infused with questions of power. And I think you bring out those questions of power very subtly in the paper, but they're there all the way through. And the second critical thing is the everyday organisation and practices of research that animate all of those different entities that are brought together in the assemblage. So it really matters how things are done in practice. It really matters how things are set up for day-to-day research in order to, it really matters in shaping the kind of interdisciplinarity that emerges. And what you're saying is that what emerges from all of that is very diverse. And I think you're saying it's diverse both horizontally in terms of a distinction between the narrow and wide interdisciplinarity. You know, are we making jumps across disciplines that are quite close to each other or disciplines that are quite a long way from each other? And that's what I see as a kind of horizontal plane in your analysis. And then it matters vertically in terms of a distinction between a kind of shallow interdisciplinarity. And I don't say shallow as a negative word. I just mean it's a description on that vertical axis, if you like. For example, talking about humans without any substantive expertise from the human or social sciences, you know, that's interdisciplinary, but it's not this kind of in-depth interdisciplinarity, towards a much more challenging kind of interdisciplinarity, which, as you talk about in the paper, where there are genuine shifts in both the ontological and epistemological dimensions of the research. So what the objects of inquiry are and how we think about them. So I found all of that incredibly useful. You packed a huge amount into a very short paper, but I've got 3 questions for you and then I'll pass over to Arthur. So my first question, you may choose to ignore all of these, but to see if there is enough any discussion. First of all, from your perspective, and I think this is not so clear in the paper, and I can guess why, does it matter? Does that diversity of interdisciplinary outcomes matter? And can you say any more about the relationships between those different kinds of interdisciplinarity? That's my, I could elaborate, but I won't at the moment. The second question, Cian, your emphasis was on doing research that's closer to society. And I think there's two different kinds, we're talking about traversing different forms of knowledge here, both between academic disciplines and between the academy and those outside of the academy. And I just wonder if you had any observations on whether those can just be conceptualized as the same, or whether there are different ways of thinking about those kinds of journeys that we might make. And then my third question, this is a bit cheeky really, your recommendations right at the end have quite a strong subtext to them. They seem to suggest that what needs to happen is that we need to disrupt established power relations. Do you mean, and I think this is what you're saying, that engineers have to open themselves to other ways of thinking and doing, to frame questions in different ways? Or do you also mean that social scientists and humanities scholars have to change the way that they think and do research as well? And I'd really be interested to hear what your thoughts on that. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks so much, Susan, for those reflections, and thanks especially for those three questions, which maybe I'll invite Ola and Cian to respond to if they want to before we open up for Q&A. But first, Arthur, thanks for joining us. It'd be great to have Arthur's reflections as well, and potentially Arthur's questions.
Thanks, Tim. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, Susan's helped me understand how to finish now, because that framing of things as questions is a cracking way to get out. So, because otherwise I was going to fill the hour, I think. Again, thank you to Ola and to Cian and to Mehdi as well. I feel in a somewhat conflicted position at the moment, because I think I'm the person that they were writing about, or at least one of the people that they were writing about when they said it was important to have critical distance from BRL, and I welcome that. I've looked at the findings and I'm kind of happy with them, other than I look at it and think, my word, we need to tidy up our website, because I think there's always sort of, there's the statement of your mission and there's what's in your heart, and it's interesting to see how these things. I very much accept the challenge that which I think was also what Susan was talking about, as the sort of spectrum of interdisciplinarity and the depth of it. I would go so far to say as that we need to find a way to get the value back in the word of interdisciplinarity. I think it's become a little bit like whatever the opposite of incremental or transformational or something. I can't remember the last time anyone did anything that wasn't transformational, and it can't all have been transformational. We would have ended up back where we started. And so I think so my first question, perhaps, so if I try and do them as I go rather than end with them, so somebody write them down, is when is it okay not to be interdisciplinary? Because not that I'm trying to deny the importance of it, but I think I think something's gone wrong in the sense that just about everything we do can't be interdisciplinary, and yet I'm pretty sure we say it is. And as I think Ola and Cian and Mehdi in the paper rightly recognised, is that it didn't necessarily mean the same thing in every place. And I think if we're going to get the value of interdisciplinarity, which I do believe in, we need to kind of clearly understand what it is. I think. I mean, that kind of, well, perhaps I'll park the point about sort of common languages. I think that's a well understood point that we know. I mean, there are, we don't all have common training, and there's a lot of words that we're using that mean very different things to different people in different fields, quite innocently. And I think what James Ladyman calls the conceptual engineering around this, which I take to mean kind of, do we actually know what we're talking about, is lacking at this time. There's lots of words running around which are in computer science speak overloaded. They just mean too much, and I think there's a need to tease that out to make that easier. Where else was I going to? So I really welcome that Cian was sort of linking it from politics with a small p almost back to with a big P, and looking at Innovate UK documents. There is the power of relationships in the discussions that we have with funders are really not so subtle. And it's something that's been a bit of an eye-opener to me as we've moved in it, is that there is almost an institutional commitment to robotics is coming. It's going to be big, and the faster it comes, the better. And I was interested in this distinction between, are we here to accelerate or are we here to steer, is a really accessible one. I really like that. And I think, Susan and I have been sort of almost burnt on occasions by suggesting that somebody might want to think about braking as well. And that's not really something that, I hate to say it, that's not really something that anyone wants to hear. And so I do kind of I would like to see us find a way. So this is what I'll make my closing question is, how do we challenge the narrative that to do this faster is better? Because I'm convinced that what's more important is that we get it right. And I was interested that, your discussions about the interactions with the residential home were, that there was way more to this work that this person was doing than simply, here's a robot, isn't it great? And I think that tells us that there's a need to moderate the pace of this and get it right and understand. So I don't think we really understand what we want from these robots. I think there's a very simplistic narrative that says, countries with more robots have higher productivity and they're richer, and we have shortage of staff here, so brilliant, throw robots at that and we'll all get rich. And lots of people have drunk the Kool-Aid and agree with that narrative. And I think what we need to find a way to do, and so my challenge is, how are we going to get through to change the collective narrative, and who needs to be part of that discussion on that narrative to get to the point where we can say, actually, this isn't fail fast, fail quick, let's try and get rich and fail many times until somebody does it. This is about doing it at the right pace and the right speed, and that the greater rewards will come to the people who get it right in the longer term. And that's where I see the benefit. So I don't think there's a polarization between sort of, robot, the engineers drive it, let's do this, technology's coming, let's just make it acceptable, versus let's slow down. I think the better route for all is to come up with the right pace and do it. But the discussions to get to that point are challenging, and it's not even clear who needs to be involved in them and how they happen. So that's my closing challenge to the group.
Great, thanks, Arthur. I really like introducing braking to the accelerating and steering kind of duo. That there's now this third element. Ola, Cian, and I'm conscious, Mehdi, you're also here with us as well. I don't know if you want to briefly respond to those 5 questions. So the 3 from Susan and the 2 from Arthur. Do you want to kind of respond to that, and then let's open up? Do pop questions in Q&A, or do raise your hand, and then I'll invite you to contribute to that as well.
Sure. I might start just with a little pitch, maybe trying to integrate some questions or interpret them. So I remember Susan was asking about the diversity of disciplinarity outcomes. So, what it matters and so on. And I think, so by outcomes, I understand, how we present the results. Are they papers, reports? Are they single discipline papers or some other papers, artwork, anything else? And I think what I would really like to see more of, it's actually integration of results in the output. So, what I understand that papers are still single discipline, and then non-academic outlets are not really that valued when it comes to, our careers and, then being valued as researchers. So we are very much pushed, obviously by reference, someone by publishing in high impact journals, which are but they are still very disciplinary, even if they claim in their main website that they are not, but they are. And I suppose also when it comes to researchers training, I would love to see more projects when there is a computer scientist really properly engaging with, say, grounded theory of thematic analysis, or say a psychologist whatever, learning a programming language and actually understanding how it works and some slightly finer level of detail. I know it's a big ask, like we all have really busy lives, but I would love to see that an extra level of integration, and I think that kind of addresses the questions of I think that both engineers need to open up to other ways of thinking and doing, but also other social sciences, and I understand that it's hard because ultimately research is collaborative, research is interdisciplinary, but our careers are individuals and our CVs are individual, and we have this idea that as researchers we need to follow some pipeline and have this like clear trajectory, and this really it's not really how it works in the real life these days, I'd say. And with regards to Arthur's points of the how do we challenge the narrative that faster is better? So again, this is a problem everywhere in technology research, but I think it's not really perpetuated by engineers or computer scientists, by kind of consultancies, but this idea of fourth industrial revolution, by this idea that there's some sort of race that if you as a company don't adopt this technology, you will stay behind. So I think that maybe I would love to see some economic type analysis of like, what does it mean, this race to technology? Like, I'm not an economist, so I don't really fully understand why this narrative is so perpetuating everywhere. And I would love to see more critique along the economic lines of like, what would actually happen if someone is a late adopter? Do they really miss out? Or is it just kind of, like a scaremongering, let's say? So yeah, these are my 2 pennies. I'm conscious of the time, so I'll let others speak.
Great, thanks, Ola. Maybe Cian?
Yeah, real quick. Does the diversity of interdisciplinary research at BRL matter? I think, yeah, but it's also the relationships between those different forms of interdisciplinarity. I think that's what I'd say quickly to that. And it's not just, I think maybe from a top-down perspective, for me, it's not just the diversity, right? But it's the distribution of that diversity, I think, is really important. And I guess, Arthur, your question of when is it okay not to be interdisciplinary, well, I'd say I'd reframe that question and say, at what stage of different projects does interdisciplinary capabilities matter? And that would be and how and maybe what we're trying to do is and Susan talked about both the social and the kind of material constraints on research capabilities. Well, we're trying to situate that, maybe what we're doing and go in that way. I'll leave it at that for the moment. You've given us 3 or 4 papers worth of thinking to do, so thank you very much for those really, really useful comments.
Mehdi, if you can hear me, I don't know if you want to offer anything, response. Don't feel like you have to, but if there's something you wanted to say at this point, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure, I can hear you. Yeah, thank you. I agree with Cian and Ola, in terms of the responses. I think like there are technical levels. Like, you design a mathematical algorithm, so that's mathematics, that's very clear. But the outcome of that algorithm might affect people's life. That's the point that you are starting, to think about being more interdisciplinary. So this is the point, actually, when I joined BRL in 2011. And I started doing human-robot interaction. That was the point I started thinking, I'm an engineer and I'm doing a stuff purely engineering, and my work outcome going to affect people's life. So that was the point, actually. Like all these paper, and all these research that we did with Ola, actually, were rooted from. So technically, I started thinking, yeah, so we need human factor, for example, analysis. We need psychologists, we need sociologists, but at that year, that point, there weren't many actually in the BRL. But now, if you look at the trend, there are a lot of engagement from different disciplines, but yeah, it's very difficult to decide, because as an engineer, I might sit behind my computer, start coding, very much enjoy it, and I might even don't like to be bothered to think about what the outcome might affect other people. But to be honest, we need to think about that, and we can't be like, single islands developing the stuff without thinking about what it's going to do to the other, to the external world.
Great, thank you so much, Mehdi. What I wanted to do was, there's 3 questions come in, and maybe just to ask this to everyone, and I think Susan and Arthur as well. One question is about the question of language barrier, and I think this gets to Susan's point about the what and how of research. And about the challenges to interdisciplinarity. And this, in particular, here's a question about language, which Arthur, you also mentioned. So maybe someone could reflect a little bit about what role does language play within the challenge of the how and why and what of research. Arthur, a question that maybe you wanted to respond to, but I think Cian and Ola as well, and Mehdi, it'd be interesting to get your sense of that about how far does the funding and the way that the funding is constructed allow for breaking? Or does the funding assume a certain set of ways of thinking about the future and about future-driven ways of thinking? And then a really interesting question about what's the role of psychologists or sociologists, so the people that kind of do the human, if you like. Is their role primarily about the human interface? So it's that moment where, if you like, the robot meets the human and there's a kind of interaction and interface. Or do you see a much bigger role for those within the human sciences, if you like, as opposed to a kind of more, I guess, functional role at the point of interfaces? And I think this gets back to maybe Cian's reframing of Arthur's question, which is about where the interdisciplinarity needs to take place. So I don't know who wants to go first, but it'd be great to get maybe some closing reflections from all of you on those really interesting questions about language as a barrier, about does the funding allow for breaking, and also about what's the role of human sciences more broadly. Is it primarily at this kind of interface, or would you see a role that's more significant than that?
I might take the first question, that's okay. So definitely language is always, both a barrier, but also an enabler. And I think, so from this research, but also from the previous project on capabilities, it definitely comes out as something that people need to agree between themselves as they are on a project. So for example, the word like algorithm, like it's in social sciences, we take it quite lightly. An algorithm could be like any rules-based systems, where a computer scientist would quite likely mean the machine learning algorithm, Or similarly, sustainability, if you're in environmental studies, you have quite radical understanding of it, whereas other people might think sustainability, like financial sustainability, anything that sustains you over a long period of time. So these sort of words, on one hand, they create productive disagreements, opportunities for like fruitful discussion. On the other hand, they can actually create some tension. So it's very important that people get these terms right. And also one other terms, I came across this paper about this word tailoring, how researchers kind of fit their research into funding requirements. So for example, quite often in social sciences, it's a little bit cheeky, so I hope there is no one in like EPSRC here, but sometimes EPSRC or like Innovate UK have quite technical understanding of like societal challenges. They, for example, they wouldn't take net zero as we understand, or climate change as we understand it. So what we do, we tailor our bid applications so that they come across a little bit more like they fit with the government industrial strategy, but actually then what we end up doing is a mix of that research for the government strategy and our own like more critical or radical research on the side in our spare time. So it is a little bit like that's kind of happening just because of how funders might most likely, UK government is framing, but we try to work with it and around it, let's say. So that's my 2 pence.
Great, thanks so much, Ola. Do feel free to chime in, Susan, Arthur, Cian, Mehdi.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I personally had to change in a research team only because of the funding, like moving from medical robotics, for example, to search and rescue robotics, or hazardous environment robotics. But there are different types of funding, and depending on the type of the funding, you may get some sort of flexibility. Like previously, European fundings were more restricted in terms of what you do, what kind of research you do. But with EPSRC, as Ola said, you get more flexibility, for example, in terms of you can play around a little bit, and technically, you may, how can I say it? You may kind of not exactly like go around the system, but you get the money, but still you have your hands are open to do more what you want to do, to be like, yeah, simple.
Thank you.
All right, so I'll follow on. I do feel like I'm being goaded into saying something nasty about the funders here, and I'm not going to, because they're just part of the same machine that we are. You know, when you have these conversations with funders, they're like, oh, you know, help us understand what we think will sell next year, or help us understand what. And actually, if you end up, you know, if you look at newspaper, there's a lot going around at the moment of people with, you know, autonomous machines with big Union Jacks painted on the side of them. And I think that, you know, digging into what's the messaging and the feeling, and, you know, what people, there are people who are trying to sell the idea, you know, the feeling of living in a technologically advanced country, and that that's somehow good for you. And I think we need to pick apart what that means. So I think it's more complicated than, you know, just us and the funders. There's you know, there is, this is why I think the interdisciplinarity matters, but not in a simplistic way, because it's not just us and the funders, it's the funders and government and the people who are responding to the messaging that comes from government, and it's a huge, great cycle. So I think it's way more complicated than that, which gives us opportunities, but also challenges. In this challenge, I give you a challenge in the narrative. My final closing thought, which is kind of trying to draw together all these questions of language, and is I think a lot of this is to do with specialization of training. So basically, when I was talking about language barriers, I was trying to gloss over the fact that I don't really understand what positivist and interpretivist mean when Ola was talking about them, and I'm pleased to hear, you know, that you know, I don't doubt that engineering does the same back. And then there's other words like autonomous, which is a pet favorite of mine, which means at least 3 different things depending on who you talk to. And so I think, you know, but these are you know, these are relatively straightforwardly fixed challenges if we can just agree what they mean. But in response to something Mehdi said, I'm reminded of engineers in Canada. So if anybody ever worked with any engineers from Canada, you'll find that engineers are great. They all have a little ring on their finger, and it's a ring made supposedly originally of some iron that was from a bridge that fell down. And the idea is there's a very solemn ceremony in Canada when you graduate as an engineer, which is where you get given your iron ring, and as you write, that iron ring taps on the paper that you write on, and the idea is that is a reminder to you, because this bridge collapsed because an engineer did their job wrong. It's a reminder to you that your work has consequences, and I think that's something that we don't have. You know, we always talk about the status of engineering in society in Britain, that it's not a protected word and so on. And I don't want to get precious about the status of that, but part of that is that we don't have that kind of societal connection with our engineering profession in quite the same way as we do with doctors, for example, or medics of also, who have a very clear ethical code and we all understand that. So I think if we can start to cultivate that, then that to me is the beginning of solutions to problems like language barriers and, like, you know, challenges of whether or not you think of consequences of your work.
Brilliant, thanks. Can I just finish off with inviting Susan and Cian to briefly respond, and maybe just to also respond to a question that's come in around cultural diversity and about very diverse populations and the kinds of ways in which robotics operate with not just this, I think you've hinted at this, Ola, this very kind of monolithic sense of the human, that actually, as we all know, being human is a much more complex thing and a much more diverse thing in all sorts of interesting ways, and how that plays out. So Susan, maybe I'd invite you to comment, and then Cian to finish off with any final comments.
Just really, really briefly, just to follow up on what Arthur said, I think he answered the question very well. The question about the research councils, you know, I think it's actually those of us that want to work in interdisciplinary ways and believe in the significance of it need to also work with the research councils. I think they are looking for people to help them to think differently about this. That said, the research councils are not autonomous, and they sit in this much broader landscape of having to go to government with their cap in hand and ask for money. So they are framing the way that they think about research in terms of the government understands, or is willing to understand. And that speaks to the bigger question that was asked by the anonymous attendee about whether there was only a role for social scientists and psychologists at the point of human-computer interaction, because actually this is a much bigger question about analysing the social world and the way in which technologies and people and inequality and power and diversity are all bound up in shaping the way that technology is framed and enacted and monetized and brought into use. So absolutely we need that integrated analysis. And I would say for social scientists, they can't do that on their own. They need to work with engineers and roboticists and others who understand what the technologies are materially, what their affordances are, what might be at the cutting edge currently of technologies. So we need that kind of end-to-end interdisciplinarity. And I think we need to work with the funding councils, difficult as it can be sometimes, to show them why that's important and give them the confidence to make that argument in their pitches to government. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Susan. And that's like the perfect raison d'etre, I guess, for BDFI as an institution to try and think about that end-to-end interdisciplinarity, as the starting point. Cian, over to you for the final thoughts.
I mean, I just kind of repeat what Susan said. And Susan, you've answered that question about engineering and social science you asked earlier. You've got at it, and that's really important. Disrupting the power relations, not just of engineering and physical sciences, but of the way social science thinks about these things, of the way it thinks about materials and technology. And I guess for me, knowledge is created socially, right? This is the point here. So whether you're working on a gradient descent algorithm or whether you're working on a human-computer interface, there's social stuff going on there. I guess for us, why are we thinking about capabilities? It's the last thing I'll say. Why are we thinking about capabilities? Because for us, originally it was a way to get at the capacity question that research councils were kind of implicitly asking when they said, let's go and do things like sustainability research, transdisciplinary research, socially appropriate AI. And they were saying we need to create capacity amongst researchers in society to do this. And for us, capabilities were a way to get at the kind of the skills, knowledge that are situated and valued by folks on the ground at different strata. So paying attention to the way those knowledges, those capabilities are valued differently by different groups, by different individuals, whether they're researchers, whether people in care settings. That's one way to get at this, the steering and maybe the braking too. So I'll leave it at that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks all. Thanks, Ola, Cian, Mehdi, for sharing the paper with us. Susan, Arthur, thanks so much for your responses. And thanks everyone for the questions and for joining us this morning. And it's been a really great kind of end to a series of workshops and also hopefully a beginning as well to some of the work that'll carry on in the next period. And in the links, I know Kerry shared details of BDFI, so you can find out more about the institute that Susan co-leads with Dimitra. Also Bristol Robotics Lab that Arthur co-leads with colleagues from UE and as well as the University of Bristol, and more about Brigstow. So do find out more if you want about all of these different institutions. And once again, thanks so much, Ola, Cian and Mehdi for sharing the paper with us this morning. We'll give you a virtual applause. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for organising.